So yes, some will know me. I'm Keith Williams. I'm also known as Sotunus, S-O-T-U-N-U-S. It is bastardized Latin. 50 points to Gryffindor if they figure out what it comes from. So my lecture is going to be on criticism as a tool of reflection and growth. I am not a big person for sitting and pontificating, so I do plan for there to be quite a bit of discussion. So if you get called to talk, please don't be too afraid. If you want to opt out of that now, feel free. I'm not going to force people to talk if they don't want to. But I am hoping for there to be a level of discussion in this, because we're going to be talking about a lot of things which I think people take for granted, and hopefully we'll take a look at them a slightly different angle. Okay, let's begin. So this is a favourite quote of mine by Noam Chomsky. Colourless green ideas sleep furiously. As a sentence, it is synaptically correct. None of those words are technically incorrect in that sentence. It technically says something. It tells us that colourless green ideas sleep furiously. But it is essentially word salad. It is meaningless. It is a sentence which structurally makes sense, but it is a meaningless sentence because of the contradictions and the non-ideas that exist in it. If you understand English, that sentence remains nonsensical to you. And this is an idea I want us to think about as we go through talking about the nature of criticism. A lot of criticism can be akin to this, nonsensical statements. So that's something to keep in mind as we go forward throughout this quote by Noam Chomsky. Okay, so introductions. I believe this is possibly one of the first lectures of the gathering. I believe there's quite a few new faces to this gathering because it's the first international one done by the internet. So if people would like to do some introductions, and I'll just give a name, and then if that person wants to unmute themselves and give their introduction. But before we do that, I shall just cover what we'll be doing in the first hour. It might not take an hour. I'm saying first hour. It could be shorter, it could be longer. Honestly, it depends on how much debate we have about each of the little topics we'll be discussing. I am expecting to allow everyone to have a break about midway, just so that we're not, to give my voice a rest, because I don't want to pontificate at you all for that long, and to let people do things. So our first hour, we're going to talk about what is criticism. We'll follow that with discussing what is that lovely buzzword, constructive criticism. We'll then go across some common sense models of giving constructive criticism. I suspect most of you, if you've ever worked in any sort of school environment, mentoring role, will have heard of most of those models. I've used the name I've encountered them under. You might have encountered them under different names, so we'll see how that goes. And then we'll discuss why is well-intentioned criticism rejected? Because that's a big hurdle I think we all face in trying to, one, accept criticism, and two, give effective criticism. Our second hour is we're going to then move on to what is reflection, becoming an effective critic, accepting and rejecting criticism, and the use of criticism as a pathway to growth. So if at any point I use a phrase, because I know I slip sometimes into psychology, so if at any point you don't understand something I've said, please feel free to send a message. Okay, so definition of criticism. It is from Oxford Languages. Something you will learn about a lot of people when they want to confirm something is they will just look at the first thing that comes up on Google or Bing or any of the search engine they use. Oxford Languages is popular definition. There's nothing wrong with this for what we're talking about. And we are looking at all three of these to some extent. So we are looking at the expression of disapproval, we are looking at the critical analysis of works for their merits and faults, and we are looking at, to an extent, not so much, but proper investigation. And hopefully by what I mean by proper investigation will come clear over time. So what is constructive criticism? I did write out my own lovely definition, and then I thought I shall just be lazy and I'll get something from definitions.net, because it's always important to use things which a lot of people know about when you are constructing anything. The more people know, the more something is known by people, the better it is. So constructive criticism, very simple. It's right there for us. But key points we want to talk about with regards to constructive criticism. Constructive criticism is not positivism. It isn't just saying positives or trying to build something purely positive. You are not complimentary for the sake of being complimentary. You do still have to make sure in the criticism you are addressing flaws and fault. Good constructive criticism emerges from reasoning. You will look at what you are trying to critique, and you will try to make sure that any critique you give comes from an actual look at what you are critiquing. It's not coming from predispositions or beliefs you have or biases you have towards the matter. And ultimately, constructive criticism has to be a partnership. You are communicating with the person. You aren't just throwing diatribe at them. You're just saying that's bad, that's bad, or that's good. You are having a conversation. You are building something together. So it has to be a conversation. You are involving yourself in the solution. So any solution you offer, you have to take ownership. So that is the essence of constructive criticism. Those are the three key points we need to keep in mind about constructive criticism. So I'm going to let people talk again, actually, at this point. I will use a hands up method if possible, please. So the sandwich method, someone's possibly heard of it. If you want to take a guess at it, let me know through the chat, and then unmute yourself. Let us know what your guess is, what the sandwich method of constructive criticism is. Ali's already beaten us to it. Oh no, looking at when you want to ask a question, look at the top for talking about all. Oh, okay, cool. The more we know. So anyone want to take, okay, Ryan, if you want to take a shot at the sandwich method?
I would guess it's probably starting with something positive, then the criticism that might be harder to hear, and then trying to end on an upbeat again.
Yep.
Sort of a good, bad, good.
Yes.
Sandwich.
Yeah. It's exactly that. It's exactly that. My only problem with the sandwich analogy is if you put something terrible in the middle of two pieces of bread, it's still going to be a terrible sandwich. The bread isn't going to make up for the terrible ingredients. So that's my problem with it. But it's essentially, as Ryan said, it's you begin with a positive or reassuring remark, then you give the criticism, and then you end with a positive remark affirming the beginning reassurance if you do it properly. Some people start with a positive remark, give criticism, end with a different positive remark, and that's not actually following the idea. The idea of the sandwich method is we're using what's called the serial position effect to create a positive experience, because people have a very good habit of remembering the start of something and the end of something, but are fairly bad at remembering the middle. So if you put the criticism, which is considered the negative experience, in the middle, hopefully people will walk away with a positive experience. And this is very... one sec, checking a message. Okay. So that's very useful when you've got children, young people. Ooh, do I need to mute people? Okay. or you've got relative beginners, or you've got people who are quite nervous. It's very useful. It's quite a common one you see bandied about, and it's very popular. It's probably the one I've encountered the most. It's probably the one I've been given most as a good strategy for constructive criticism. It does have disadvantages. Because you're relying on the serial position effect, with the criticism being in the middle, it can very easily be forgotten because you've placed it where people are less likely to remember it. Some argue because it's a negative effect, it will have more power than most information. So that's a counter argument there. But another danger of this is because criticism is always negative. If your affirmation, your positive statements aren't good, aren't coherent, as I said, if you do it poorly, you start with one positive remark, end with another, instead of effective affirmation and reinforcement of the positiveness. Oh, hello?
Why is criticism always negative?
I'm going to go on to that in a bit, okay?
From the hurt, but I realise I'm from a different creed than the rest of you. I don't think criticism is always negative, but that's just, like, this is an honest question. I just want to know why is criticism negative?
I am going to get onto that later. It's a slide later.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's okay. I will be going into studies and so forth, and some statistics and so forth. No, fair question. I said if people don't, just put it in the chat and I'll try and get to it. If it's something that I'll get to with a later slide, we'll just leave it to a later slide, or we'll be here all evening and I'll be repeating myself quite a bit. So the power of 3 to 1, this is a less common one. Again, would anyone like to take a swing? Again, if you volunteer yourself in the chat and then unmute yourself when I prompt you.
I can't do the two. Well, I could, I suppose. Put this guy on.
Yeah, if you want to put yourself forward, go for it, yeah. So the power of 3 to 1.
Listen, I just hope there was a little... I mean, if I have to wait, I have no problem with that. But
okay.
I apologize.
No.
No
need to apologize. No need to apologize at all.
The aim is kiss. Deal with it.
Guys, so would anyone like to take a swing at what the power of 3 to 1 as a strategy for constructive criticism is?
Well, with the Dharma, you always have the 3 to 1, and I think, like, whenever you do anything that's a little bit negative, I think due to the echo effect, you get 3 times more because that's how the world works. But I would imagine you're talking about something different. But I would go up.
Oh, I've got a bing. Yeah, that's what it is, Ryan. That is essentially what it is. The basic premise is that for every negative criticism you give, you should provide 3 positive comments.
My name's Dan. You can go with Kiss, Dan, but Ryan, I don't know who Ryan is.
Oh, sorry. No, sorry, Ryan posted his answer.
Oh, okay. Oh, my apologies.
Yeah. Sorry, Dan.
I'll try and keep the trap shut for a bit.
Okay. I'll put everyone back on mute mode. Okay, there we go. So the basic premise is that for every negative criticism given, you should provide 3 positive comments. But some say different things about how many it should. It should be 2, or it could be 4, or it could be... It depends. Depends. You see this one more in circles where you're giving feedback on articles or essays, where for everything you pick out, which you feel is poor writing, poor scholarship, or so forth, you should give more feedback. You don't generally see this in more practical circumstances, such as exercise and so forth. So there's a lot of advantages to it. It does make you think in positive terms, because you are having to think of more positive feedback than negative criticisms. So it does help you with positive thinking. It can be which is why it's often used, as said, in tutoring circles where you're working with really long pieces of work, and it can become a bit of a marathon intellectually, and thus it becomes very easy to start thinking in very excessively critical terms instead of communicating in a growth-based way. But as it says exactly there, feedback escalation. Could you imagine if you were trying to mark something which was 8,000 words long, and for every mistake you found you had to think of 3 positives? And ultimately in life there are some things where there's nothing positive to say. An idea is just poorly thought out or incomplete, and you just have to say to a person, look, this just isn't workable. You just need to take this idea out. It's not workable. So sometimes you just aren't going to find one positive thing about something, and you have to. So this is why as a strategy it's not always spectacular, because you're always looking for a lot of positives, and though it can put you in a good mindset, it can be a lot of work and time consuming, and sometimes it can be a little disingenuous. So the balancing act, again, if someone could volunteer what they think the balancing act is, just to keep things going quickly, if you just put it in chat, please, just to stop any talking over each other and so forth. Now, give people a minute or two to sort that. Yes, functionally so. It is. It's a little more nuanced than just going 50-50. It's not just giving one bad and good. There's a reason it's called the balancing act, to specify. So the idea is almost like the power of 3. You are looking for a positive versus a negative. So you're not just giving one negative criticism, you're not giving one positive criticism, you're giving both. But the idea of the balancing act is you need to nuance it. So you are looking at the same thing and you're saying one good thing about the idea and one poor thing about the idea. So it's addressing the same thing but from a different angle. So the great advantage of this is it's based on contextualization. It forces you to talk about the specific thing you are focusing on. You are talking about what is good about it and what is bad about it. So if it's part of a bigger whole, it can be very useful in refining ideas. And this is generally something you see in more esoteric circles of secret knowledge, such as engineering circles, such as crafting circles, and so on and so forth. So disadvantages, again, same problem with the power of 3. Sometimes there's just nothing good to say about something, as hard as you dig, as deep as you dig to find something positive to say about something. Okay. All right. Okay. Just yeah, I understand. So positive is essentially reinforcement. It's reassurance. It's complimentary. Negative is you are, I won't say criticism, but you are being critical. You are stating there's a problem with it. You're calling something problematic. You could describe the balancing act as a diluted form, but as I said, the power of 3 is just about finding 3 positives to a negative, or more positives than negatives you're presenting. The balancing act is about saying something positive and negative exactly about the same thing. And again, it's a strategy and it will only work in certain contexts. And again, going back to the other problem with 3 is that some ideas are just, they do not have a redemptive quality. And sometimes trying to say something positive about something irredeemable, you're wasting time, you'll come across as insincere. So importance there. Okay, so the solution-driven method. This is one that's come into vogue very recently. I'm just going to switch the light on in case I'm sitting here in the dark. The solution-driven method is quite popular. Again, if someone would like to offer something in chat, if they've got a guess about what the solution-driven method is. Again, I'm not too concerned about people being exactly on the hitting the nail exactly on the head. Something in the ballpark based on the name. As I said, I'm just using the names I've encountered these as. You might have encountered these ideas under different names. Here we go. Yeah, pretty much. It's about you approach the problem in a manner where whatever criticism you offer, you are just giving a solution. It's very popular now. So in a lot of ways, you're not necessarily giving criticism. You're giving the solution, but the solution should reveal or be based on the criticism you'd otherwise be giving. So you see this a lot again with people who work with youth, where the idea when you are criticizing a young person's work or something is to offer them a solution, to offer them guidance. You see this in a lot of management training now as well, where managers are being told instead of just beating down your workers, if you have a problem, you need to be talking about solutions. And again, it's very corporate driven. You find this a lot now in corporate methodology, is this solution driven method. Wonderfully, the advantage of it and why it's so popular is how it does frame criticism. Criticism now is not just something given, it's we identify a problem and we solve it. Great mentality, very good, but it does have a fault. This very much impacts on the autonomy of the recipient, because you, as the individual giving the critique, are offering the solution. You are giving them a solution, you are talking about a solution, and so you generally, instead, framing the criticism in this solution-driven mindset can often confuse and disguise what the explicit criticism is, and sometimes people need to hear that explicit criticism if there's any hope of them self-correcting. So that's a big disadvantage of this whole solution-driven method, and sometimes it can create a false sense of empowerment, because there's problems which are incidental to your situation and you can do nothing about, and sometimes they need to be brought up and addressed, and you can't always offer a solution to something you have no power over. You see this a lot, especially in charity organisations, because charity organisations, of course, you don't necessarily always get who's best for a job, you get who's willing to do the job and you hope they're good at it. And that's just a fundamental part of charity work. You get the volunteers and you hope you get the best you can. You don't always, and there's not any real solution to that aside from start paying people and hiring the best people, and that's not volunteering anymore. So, why do people reject constructive criticism? So this is hopefully explaining what you're asking before, Dan. Is criticism a bad thing? Unfortunately, yes. Most human beings are not very good with what can be framed as a negative experience. In this sense, let's say a negative experience is something that causes emotional distress, anger, sadness, and so forth. Generally speaking, emotional experiences you don't go chasing down. And there's been interesting studies. The most famous one, 20 years, almost 20 years old now, is of course Baumeister with the bad is stronger than good. There are some problems with their methodology and how they operationalized. That means basically how they defined positive and negative. But basically their studies suggest that it can take up to 5 positive events to correct if you've had 1 negative event. Human experience isn't mathematical in that respect. It isn't just a case of, we're not slot machines. It's not a case of you have to put the right amount into something to make people happy. That's not how human beings work. But this is a very interesting study. It does suggest that we react overtly to negative experiences, and in this case it said emotional distress and so forth, more than things which are reassuring and bring us happiness. And coming to criticism, most people will experience criticism as a negative experience. They will fall into a defensive mindset and they will immediately experience, oh, I'm being criticized, and their emotional baggage, their emotional response is sadness or anger or frustration and so forth. And again, there's been interesting studies which suggest that people are 4 times more likely to remember negative criticism than they are to remember praise. They're 4 times more likely to remember criticism no matter how it's given, and they're 4 times more likely to remember it as a negative experience. So this is why people do reject constructive criticism, even if you've done your best to present it in a effective manner. Again, people, you might have heard this a lot in recent times, confirmation bias, that people, generally speaking, like to experience things confirming their existing beliefs. Criticism are challenges of belief about yourself as a competent individual, as a good individual, and so on and so forth. 1 second, guys, something's happened here, so I can't see. Oh, sorry, I couldn't see the chat for a moment there. Sorry, guys. So if I've missed anything. Yeah. Yes, it's negative emotionally. People receive it as a negative emotional experience, and there's not much we can do about it, unfortunately. And so a lot of people engage in, so back to point 2, 1960s confirmation beliefs, people generally avoid cognitive dissonance, cognitive discomfort, by essentially seeking out their beliefs they agree with that exist already. This isn't new. It's been talked a lot about in the digital era, but human beings have always done it. People have always gone to the churches they prefer, people have always read the newspapers they prefer, and so on and so forth. There is a more nuanced take on it recently, that it's not necessarily people who are seeking to confirm their beliefs, but they are very naive scientists, and so even when they are curious, what they will do is they will search for an answer, and then they will pick the answer which is least just uncomfortable. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So even people who are well-intentioned and go about their way to confirm a story or so forth, they're very likely, as I discussed before, type in the search engine, go to the first answer which feels right to them, and they'll take that answer. Big problem to overcome. And finally, this is probably the most I will get into sophisticated psychological theories tonight, hopefully, or this afternoon for most of us. Good time zone, everyone. Locus of control is essentially where we center our beliefs about responsibility for outcomes. So if we have a strong internal locus of control, we'll generally take credit, be it for good or for ill, for things happening to us and outcomes happening onto ourselves. Whereas if we have a strong external locus of control, we'll place blame on everything around us. instead of taking any personal responsibility. Both of those extremes are maladaptive. You do encounter people like that, people who will never take responsibility for their own actions, blame everything, and then people who will irrationally blame themselves for the weirdest stuff, which, as you examine it, doesn't really follow any rationale aside from, I was there, so it must have been my fault. That's not how it works, but that's what they believe. Most human beings have an egocentric balance to protect the ego, to feel good about themselves, which is they like to believe they're responsible for their successes, and they tend to blame failures on other things than their own faults. And this is why people reject constructive criticism, is because they don't like to take blame, because it hurts. Okay, so much learning does not teach understanding. And that's by our good friend from the 6th century, Heraclitus. Yes, there's a lot of theories of intelligence. There's emotional intelligence, there's global intelligence, and so on and so forth. Reality is that knowledge in one area does not necessarily mean you have knowledge in other areas. Learning in of itself will not teach you understanding. So this is our next quote for the next bit. Knowledge does not equate wisdom. So reflection, again, Oxford languages, you're not going to go far wrong with Oxford languages when you're trying to define an English word. So the one we're thinking about when we're talking about reflection now is serious thought or consideration. Okay, so some of you might have heard of self-reflective awareness. It has become quite popular in a lot of mentoring roles, the idea of self-reflective awareness. So some of you might have heard of the idea of metacognition, or metacognitive abilities, and essentially this is it's basically thinking about your own thinking. There is an idea of self, often used in humanistic psychological circles and in counselling circles, but there are three versions of all of us. That there is the self that observes, so there is our self that is observing what we are doing. There is our idea of self, our belief about ourselves and who we believe ourselves to be, and then the third person, which is the self that exists in the mind of others. And in theory, there's as many other selves as yourself that exist in the mind of others as people you know. And so, the observer, that last bit becomes more relevant later, so don't ignore the last bit about me talking about the self that exists in the mind of others, please. Metacognition is basically observing your own thoughts, your own feelings as they occur. And it is an ability that can some have quite naturally. It's an ability others need to develop and learn. As we are discovering again with more recent discoveries, is that there are people who have quite a rich internal life, and when they think, their cognitions appear to them as an inner voice. And then there's other people who lack this ability, and for them they need to express their thoughts in some manner. They do not have this inner voice which expresses their thoughts. They just have this very tangible, intangible process going on behind the scenes. And one advantage of self-reflective awareness is that we can start examining the story of the self. Because our lives are a narrative. What I did yesterday, what I do today, this is all an ongoing story. And the best way to understand another person is to understand their story, what has made them who they are, why they've arrived at the point they are at, and where they plan to go. And if you can observe this story from a distance, if you can look at your own story and create a narrative, that is clear, that explains all this. You can best explain yourself to another person. If you can say how you honestly feel to a person in a way that they can comprehend, you'll have a much better chance of them understanding yourself. Excuse me, sorry. But another element of this is if you can observe your own story, you can ask questions about your story. You can explore your own story. You can ask, what changes would you make? I don't know why I'm talking at my mic, so my camera's up there. Sorry. And ultimately, that is the benefit of self-reflective awareness, learning to look at yourself and your own thoughts, learning to think about your thinking. Why do you believe as you do? Why do you feel as you do about something? In doing that, you can start with self-critique. But at the same time, I said it's a lovely bridge to help other people understand you better if you can fully explain yourself in an articulate way. So, how do we cultivate self-reflective awareness? 3 rules of thumb, even though we only have 2 thumbs. Bit of a meta joke going on here. So our first rule of thumb in cultivating self-reflective awareness, there are no magic tricks. I'm not going to be able to give you a spell or some routine you can do and you'll get this, that you will develop self-reflective awareness. In anything in life, the only way to really cultivate it is if you find value in it and you think it's important and you find it meaningful and you put the effort in yourself. Second rule of thumb, we are not in a video game. We are not video game characters. We are not Sims. Our past effort does not automatically become an ability we unlock and find and we have it, or we can pay for certain abilities. That might be satire on plastic implants. But yeah, you can't. You've got to keep working at things. If you want to be able to bench 300 pounds and keep being able to bench that much, you've got to get to the gym on a regular basis and train. It's not, oh, I can bench 300 pounds, I can stop weightlifting now. No, you'll lose that strength very quickly. And cognitive skills are the same. You've got to keep working at them. And finding knowledge is a tool. And like any tool, it's only as effective as the craftsman. If you don't put the effort into understanding the applications of the knowledge you develop and the tools you have, none of this is going to work for you. You have to work on knowledge. You have to understand the application of knowledge. And this is part of cultivating self-reflective awareness. And the big thing I say there is what is right for today may be wrong for tomorrow. We all change. We all have different context. We all have different emotional baggage. And we could be living in a wonderful ivory tower today where we find everything really easy because we don't have any real big problems. And then tomorrow we could be in a car crash that changes our life, and what we've learnt about ourselves and what works for us whilst we've been in this lovely or place which will seem paradise-like will not necessarily work in this new world. So you've always got to learn to apply new knowledge, keep learning. Okay, so some 8, and this is where I was saying this is where we could start getting a bit controversial. And if everyone was talking at the same time, we'd probably be here all night. Going to try and not repeat myself, but there are some points in this which have to be reiterated to contextualize everything. So, your first is recognizing your view of self and how others view you differs. This, I realise, is a bit of a tricky sentence. What it means is you have to always be mindful, and this is going back to that third person, this third idea of self that always exists in other people's minds. It's going back to that. Your view of self is fundamentally different to other people's view of you. So when we sit down and talk with another person, we're talking to our idea of them and they're talking to their idea of us. And if the conversation goes well and you communicate well and you develop a degree of intimacy and let the mouse down, their idea of you that exists in their head will get closer to your idea of you that exists in your head. And it's a journey. And so that's part of cultivating self-reflective awareness. It's always being aware that your view of self is uniquely your view of yourself. It's not a construct that exists in anyone else's mind. When you walk down the street, yes, you might think of yourself as a good person. You might be a great person. But anyone else walking down that street, or just some bloke on the street, or some woman on the street, they don't see this magical menu which says, ah, good person. It's not how life works. We all live in a unique culture. We all live in unique subcultures, and we all, generally speaking, we go between different subcultures most days of our lives. We go from our work subculture to our subculture at home. Right now, all of us are in the Jedi subculture. We're talking to each other as Jedi, or people related in the Jedi community. Because, yes, not all of us identify as Jedi here. Some of us are new to the path, deciding it's new to them. But we're talking to each other in that frame, in that subculture. We'd probably talk to each other very differently if we met in a pub. Different context, and why we're there is different. So self-awareness is recognizing the different cultures you step in and out of throughout your day, and recognizing that you have a unique and distinct culture. You might think, I don't have a lot of rituals in my culture. I don't have a unique language. You do have a culture. It can be quite nebulous. But what you value and so forth is your culture. Who you value is what your culture and so forth. All right. So, before I start repeating myself, your story begins with your history. We all come from somewhere, and this goes back to culture. And part of understanding our past and where our story is now is understanding our familial relationship. And family isn't just blood, isn't just parents, it is the village that raised you. It's the people that surrounded you in your developmental time. It's the people you consider your kin. And that's your family, and your family shapes you. Your interaction with them shapes your ideal of self, who you think of yourself. So it's very important to understand your place in your family, what your family means to you, and who you are as a family member is a big question. Who you are in the space of all your connections is a big question that defines you and your responsibilities and so forth. What in your life brings you meaning? This can be a difficult one. By meaning, it doesn't mean... Meaning is... Sorry, I've forgotten my script a little. I'll just have a quick read. Apologies. You know, I'll just talk my way through this. Meaning is the thing which makes you feel your life is worthwhile. That you have a valuable and purposeful life. And if we are lucky, some of us... Oops, sorry. One sec. Oh, be right back. If we are lucky, we will find that a good point... Oh, what's going on here? Sorry. We'll find that... So when we're on reflection, when we think about the meaning of our life, it is what has made my life meaningful. This could be our attachments back to our family members. That could be we have children. It could be the work we've done in the world. It could be the work we do in our community. But ultimately, what makes your life meaningful? What gives your life purpose? Some people haven't found that. Some people might not have thought very strongly on it and might not realise they do have some idea of their meaning in life. But again, it depends on how much effort you've put into self-reflective awareness, how aware you are of that sense of mortality. So finally, what are your values? Values are interesting. A lot of people can be quite contradictory. So I've put in this qualifiers, what do you feel and believe? That should be believe, good lord. Too late to correct that typo now, unfortunately. What do you feel and believe is important about humanity? So I shall give some self-disclosure, because it's a good example, and I know it's a double standard. I personally believe that if looking at the hard evidence, looking at methodology, that the best way to deal with illegal drugs is legalize most of them, introduce safety standards and tax them, and undermine the black market and start treating addiction as a health problem. Looking at all the evidence I know about, that rationally, from an intellectual point of view, I do believe that is something that needs to be considered and is probably a good solution. But I also know, on one level, I would be quite upset if I discovered one of my loved ones was a drug user, because there is a part of my personal value system where I disagree with the use of recreational drugs. And that's a double standard. And both are a value about humanity. And so we can have contrasting and conflicting values. And there is a theory regarding depression and other systematic mental illnesses that it's actually being unable to live according to your innate values, what you truly believe, is why people do develop exogenic depression and so on and so forth. So self-awareness of your values is very important. So next point, reflect on criticism and your avoidance behaviour. So we've already talked about how criticism is for most people, criticism is experienced as an emotionally negative experience. It's upsetting, it causes anger, and so on and so forth. Part of self-reflective awareness is learning to what are your avoidance behaviours. Because avoidance behaviours are not just related to criticism. Oh, 1 second. Well, thank you, Ryan. Yeah, fair point. Fair point. And ultimately, reflecting on criticism and your avoidance behaviours. We all do things to avoid things. And it's not just criticism. There's a lot of things we do to avoid negative feelings in general. Video games, when we can't think of anything else to do. Eating, when we can't think of anything else to do. Drinking, when we can't think of anything to do. Watching videos on TV, when we can't think of anything else to do. Especially if we do have something we think we should be doing, but we don't feel up to doing it, or we fear the failure of trying. So the pain of trying to play a sport, for example, is that actually you might discover you're not very good at it, even if you feel you, and that can be in contrast, especially if you're a young, quite fit person. If you've got this egotistical mindset that you're pretty athletic and you go to a sport and you fail miserably at it, that can be debilitating. And you do see that a lot in martial arts, for example. Someone who comes in, they're pretty big, they're pretty strong, they're pretty fit, and it just doesn't go right for them on the mat. They discover they're just not very good. And the reality is no one is good at these things when they first start, but people have these ideas about themselves. And so people will avoid doing things they possibly consider meaningful or in line with their personal values because of the potential for negative experiences. So people who will avoid competitions because they don't want to discover, actually, well, I'm not a very good competitor, even if they love the sport. They might, oh, I don't want even. And so we avoid negative outcomes, even though the positive outcomes would probably outweigh them. So it's important to look at your avoidance behaviours, because sometimes your avoidance behaviours can be very destructive. especially when you're supposed to be getting on with things, and you know what you're supposed to be getting on with is quite boring, tedious, and painful, such as that essay that's due tomorrow night. But you'll watch an episode and then I'll start on it after. That's a classic one at the university students. So this one, 7's a bit different. What are your needs? Feel free to Bing if you've heard it. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, very intuitive, very simple, and it's just a temple of things you need. Pyramid, sorry, not a temple. Triangle, there we go. And it starts with very basic biological needs and then comes all the way to self-actualization. But human beings are wonderful creatures that can will themselves to death. We can have all the biological needs fulfilled, and it will not become this wonderful progressive triangle up towards self-actualization, towards happiness, and so forth. Can have all our biological needs fulfilled, and we still don't want to be alive. Indeed, they do try to circumvent the pyramid. At the end of Maslow's life, he felt it should have been turned upside down, or even 2 pyramids. Because ultimately, if you are depressed, or if you suffer from very severe mental health problems, you're not going to have the capacity to get up to get and fulfill your basic physiological needs. It's a terrifying, debilitating thing, depression, where people will just want to lie in bed and do nothing. And as I said, people have willed themselves to death through inactivity. So, what are your needs? They're not simply biological. It's basically what does motivate you to get up in the morning. And this is tied into what is meaningful in your life. But it's a bit more urgent. It's a bit more straightforward. So, basically, if I don't get up and do my job, I'll lose the job. And though I don't feel like it today, it's a job I genuinely enjoy. It does bring me money, so I'll get up and go and do it. So your need is to do the job to get the money, and you genuinely enjoy the job. So great. So that's what it's been talking about. What is the need? What is the urgent thing? When you first get up, what is the thing that makes you think, I need to get out of bed? And then it's what you think you need throughout the day. What do I need? So it's talking about those essentials which pinged you to get something done. And the things that you'll get done even when you don't really feel like it. Aside from when we're talking about the extreme examples I just gave before about depression and so forth. So we're going to get to the last one. There's a reason I've chosen privileges and vulnerabilities instead of strengths and weaknesses. Because again, going back to locus of control, and going back to that idea of sometimes you're in a lovely ivory tower, and what we know works perfectly whilst we're in this lovely circumstances, and then they go out the window the moment things change. So a lot of what we might mistakenly think of our strengths, of our achievements, we could potentially have just because of circumstance, because of the people we've met in our lives, because of the opportunities we have uniquely found. So privilege, we all have certain privileges. Some more than others, some incidental, some statistical, some structural, but we all have privileges. And if they are taken away, no matter the number of personal strengths you have, it might not make a difference. So self-reflective awareness is recognizing what have I got to my benefit, which is actually largely out of my control. So it's recognizing its external forces. It's taking locus control from the self. Because you can also see this as what are my strengths, because our strengths often come from our opportunities for learning, our upbringing, what we've been given to become who we are. Our strengths evolve from our past. So our strengths are also, in many ways, if they've worked to our benefit, a result of a privilege at some point in our lives. And again, weaknesses don't matter if you've got something to always cover it. You know, there's plenty of billionaires who have very little physical strength, and yet there's the most powerful people in the world. That personal weakness is not really a factor in their life and how they're living it. But they're still vulnerable. They'll still have vulnerabilities. And again, this is all about being mindful of your locus of control. You do have strengths and weaknesses, but you do have privileges and vulnerabilities, and you need to look at both. What is my responsibility? What is the responsibility of my environment? Okay, so these are, generally speaking, your 8 things to look at for cultivating self-reflective awareness. Okay. So now, okay, we're into the last 45 minutes now. Okay, so we are on time, don't worry. But I will start speeding up a little now. Becoming an effective critic, it might sound weird, but being an effective critic actually starts with having aspirations towards good outcomes. It does start with being a person that others can trust as a source of information and wisdom. It also, in self-critique, it is also about not being horrible to yourself. It's about giving the compassion and kindness you would expect others to have to yourself. So for me, my day job is I'm a psychologist, and one of the 4 principles we have underlying our ethical guidelines are respect, competence, responsibility, and integrity. Those of you familiar with the Jedi compass will know that integrity and responsibility are part of the Jedi compass, but strangely enough, reading through, respect maps quite well with tolerance, and competency maps quite well with discipline. So respect in this context, or tolerance, is it's having personal regard for the person across from you. It's, despite differences and so forth, you are not approaching them with a sense of judgment. They are just a human being across from you that you are talking to. Competence, knowing what you're talking about, basically. You can't give good criticism if you don't know what you're talking about. That's it. You can pretend you can. Plenty of people do it on YouTube. Plenty of people do it on Discord and so on and so forth. But you can't give good feedback, good criticism, if you aren't competent in what you're talking about. And a lot of criticism I do see is, even if it's off competent individuals, if it's unsolicited, they're just reassuring themselves that they are competent. They're not giving it from a good place. 3, responsibility. If you're going to criticize someone, be responsible for it. You've offered your viewpoints, you've offered your thoughts. Be prepared to answer further for them. You've volunteered your wisdom. You've volunteered your intellect to give this critique. If that person comes back and says, "Can I have more criticism, please?" You're responsible for it. In the same sense that if you upset this person and they take it a certain way, you're responsible for the outcome. Unfortunately, intent does not equal outcome. Outcome is what you get. Doesn't matter what your intent was. The vote to hell was paid for good intentions. And finally, integrity. And this one underlines all the rest. Being responsible, being honest. Yes, honesty. You are honest about your competency. When you say you are going to take responsibility, you honour that responsibility. When you say you respect someone, you accept someone, you mean it. It's not just something you're saying. Okay, so this is one, if you want to just read through it quickly. Becoming an effective critic. So in psychology, in counselling psychology, and in most forms of therapeutic environments, there is a skill set we call challenging. And challenging on its basic level is you are just, it's exactly what it says on the tin. You are challenging someone's thought, belief that they have expressed. There are various different ways you can challenge a thought. But I want to cover these skills because, one, I'm very familiar with them. I've always found them very useful, and I found these skills useful in other environments where I've had to give feedback and criticism. So when I've been teaching karate, when I've been tutoring music, and so on and so forth, I've found these skills very useful. So I'd like to cover them. So, lovely diagram. This is just from the Counselling Council of Britain. Lovely diagram. Bit different from just my writing. I hope everyone's enjoying it. Unfortunately, it doesn't come in any more exciting colours than this. So, where's atomic pink when you want it? So your basic skill is attending, and again, all of these things pretty much mean what they say. Attending means that when you enter the room and you're talking to someone, you're paying attention to them. You are there. You are attending. Your mind is not elsewhere in the world, or in the galaxy, as the case may be. Or you've not left it in bed, or you've not left it at the coffee pot. That's the basic skill of attending. Reflecting and paraphrasing. Some people use this really badly. Some people don't understand what it is and talk about it. It's confirming you're listening. That's all it really is. You want to listen, and when silence emerges and they seem to want it, and an answer is wanted, you just repeat in a manner the salient points of what you've been told, but you use your own words. And basically, you are confirming you're listening. And this is very important in a conversation, in a critical conversation, especially when you have given the criticism and someone talks back and gives you their reasons, and then you need to listen to those and then communicate back. That's why that's an important skill in mentoring and offering good criticism. Summarizing, like reflecting and paraphrasing, you are taking what they've said and you are feeding it back. But summarizing is usually used at the end of a session in counselling. You will see the skill of summarizing used different ways. Sometimes it's a debriefing almost by the counsellor or the mentoring individual at the end, or even the manager. Sometimes this is used in managerial skills when they've had a conversation with the worker and the manager will say, okay, this is what I think you've said to me. Ta-da. So summarizing is a bit like reflecting and paraphrasing, but you use it at the end. But importantly, as said, it's used as a grand total of the conversation. Questions, very important. So these are basic counselling skills, but these all come into challenging skills as well. Questions. If you don't understand something, ask. This one is one which is missed a lot in offering good criticism. If you as a critic didn't quite understand, ask. Ask a question. Because I was bored or I didn't understand is not useful feedback. And if you don't understand, that falls on you. That doesn't necessarily fall on the person you're offering criticism to. If they tell you what they meant and then you still think that was completely obtuse, then you can use that criticism. You've not presented this in a way allowing for understanding. So questions you use to better understand positions. And generally speaking, it's always wise to use questions, because even if you're the expert in the subject you're talking about, you're not necessarily going to understand their perspective on it. So always use questions. Questions are always good to use. These last two are challenging skills as well. Aside from just basic skills, these are challenging skills. And they're quite similar again as reflecting, paraphrasing and summarizing. But focusing is if you hear something new, different, that doesn't quite gel or make sense with the rest. It's focusing in on that and using that as an avenue of discussion. And when it comes to criticism, that can be useful if someone has presented an idea which doesn't seem complete. It can be useful to figure out motivations that might not be talked about and so forth. So focusing is picking on something and focusing down on it. Immediacy is similar, but immediacy is about bringing the conversation back into the present. And this is a lot more of a counselling skill, I would say, than necessarily a critical skill, but it can be sometimes. So, or a mentoring skill, it can be sometimes. Let's just see. Oh, someone talking about. Okay, yeah. These are very much active listening skills. These evolve from the principle of active listening. So immediacy is just bringing things back to the present, especially when people have trailed off and started talking about things which are not relevant to the current conversation, especially if it comes across as a deflective tactic, which you do find in counselling, and especially going back to how people find criticism an uncomfortable situation. People will trail off when you're trying to have a conversation to try and avoid talking critically. Sometimes that means they're just not interested and just let it lie, especially if it's a friend or something. There's no point getting into an argument because then you've lost them. But sometimes if you're in a situation where you must have that conversation, immediacy is an important skill. It's recognizing, okay, I need to bring this back to the present. This is not useful information. And that's a challenging skill because it's challenging a person to talk about what you want to talk about, which can always be dangerous. People love to talk, they don't like to listen. And they don't like to talk about things they don't want to talk about. Rapport building. Possibly the most important of any of this, and going back to that principle of third person, of your third version of self that exists inside the mind of others. You don't necessarily need to become a friend with someone, but you need to become a source of trust. You need to become someone who you engender a sincere belief that your actions are to their benefit. You are not there to be to criticize them as a punishment, to just hurt them, or you are there to help them. And this is why it's very important to always build a rapport. Of people, sometimes in our community, fall into what I call white coat syndrome. White coat syndrome is when people trust someone because they look nice and professional and they have a big title. So when you go into a hospital, you trust someone who's doctor something and he's wearing a white coat. And in a lot of ways, sometimes if you are used to that, or you have worked hard for a title, you've worked hard for the community, generally speaking, you can fall into the trap of white coat syndrome, which is because you've put all this past work in, people should trust your opinion because you've got the big fancy title. Sometimes it works. If people have come in and they've expected to be challenged, if they've expected their thoughts to be deconstructed, if they've expected that, then some might accept that. Others will not give you the white coat treatment. They will just see a name on a screen and they'll not know what you've done in the community. They will not know your achievements. And if you start being a critic, if you start trying to be critical, you will just lose them forever. Because a big response to criticism is Connolly, the international language is Billy Connolly. You'll just get the silent, and I apologise for swearing, but it's the joke, Billy Connolly. You'll just get the silent fuck off, and you've lost that person because you've come at them offering criticism and you have no rapport. They have no reason to trust you. So you've come at them, attacking them with criticism. Could be the best criticism in the world. It could actually be what they need to hear. But because they don't trust you, and because they're also not in a space where they're coming to you for that criticism, for that help, they don't trust you and they're not ready mentally for it. And you've just lost them. And finally, silence. Silence is a lovely skill to develop. I wish more people had it. I think I should develop it more, to be honest. Some silences don't need to be broken. Sometimes people will say something to you and you need to sit back, pause, let the silence reign and think. Not everything needs an immediate response. Not all quiet needs to be filled by noise in a conversation. Silence is important, especially when you are critiquing. Say something, let the person breathe, let the silence reign, come back to a conversation. Take pauses, take time to think. Okay, so all our basic counselling skills, and hopefully I've explained how those can be used in other mentoring circumstances, how you can use them in a critical, when you're offering criticism, when you're in a conversation where you are trying to give feedback. Challenging skills. So, we've already talked about immediacy. I mentioned self-disclosure earlier, where I used the example of my personal value system regarding recreational drug use. So self-disclosure is a very useful technique where you can hopefully, if you are with someone and you're trying to get closer, create a connection, and they've given you a story, you can exchange a story, you can talk about a similar experience. And definitely if your experience went differently to theirs, you can use it to challenge their assumptions about how that experience should be. You can use self-disclosure as a tool to deconstruct expectations. The danger of self-disclosure is, again, it's going back to degrees of intimacy. If that person didn't really want to know about you, if that person feels as though, hang on, you're coming on a bit too friendly here, and especially if they just wanted to be heard, they didn't want to be talked to about it, because that happens. Sometimes people will come to you, pretend they want criticism and feedback, they just want to be heard. Time to learn, that's another skill to talk about in a bit. So self-disclosure, very useful skill. Just be very wise about how you use it. Just be very careful about how you use it, especially if you're sort of on a pedestal to someone and you tell them a story from your history where you weren't quite the person you are now, and you might hurt their impression of you, and it can be difficult to win back ground from stuff like that. So reframing, again, as we say on the picture, and this is very useful in criticism, especially in the arts and so forth. Reframe what they're doing. So what they're doing might just not work in what they're doing. Reframing is basically you are taking what they've given you and you're changing the context, you're discussing the context, you're changing the lens by which it's seen. And this is very useful in criticism because sometimes criticism can get sidetracked and it can get off the mark, and people can start talking about things that don't need to be talked about. So reframe it, change the context. And it can be a wonderful tool when you want to make criticism, but part of the criticism is it's not working the way it is. So you can use reframing to say, but if you did it this way, in this context, it might work. So, great way as a problem solver, reframing. It's under clinical conditions, reframing is slightly different to that. But within the context of mentoring, giving feedback, that's how you somewhat use reframing. As said, I'm not going to give you how we would do it under clinical circumstances because it's not going to be useful to most of you. So metaphors. This is a big one. People can often talk in metaphors and analogy to avoid talking about concrete matters. And these can confuse giving feedback. These can confuse talking about problems in a clear and concise manner. But some people actually understand things in metaphors. So in terms of challenging skills, it's challenging the metaphor. Why is this person using a metaphor? Is it a way to avoid talking about something on a level? It can be very revealing in a mentoring capacity when you're talking about, but they haven't really thought the problem through. it can be evidence of avoidance. So sometimes you want to challenge metaphorical talk, you want to challenge the use of analogies, especially when they don't scale. Especially when they won't scale to, sorry, the ghost is closing my door again. I don't believe in ghosts, it's just the wind. I just thought that probably sounds a bit weird to people. So, talking about metaphors and then going on about ghosts. So yeah, metaphors is a challenging skill. Learn to challenge metaphors. Learn to challenge ways that people use to disguise what they actually mean when they have an incomplete thought or they are avoiding something. Psychoeducation, again, very specific to Connor. You might have heard the idea. Others who've been involved in mentoring education or this sort of thing, you might have heard of psychoeducation, which is where you are educating the person on psychology. You're basically making the person more aware of cognitive science so that they can take it and apply it. So how do we apply this in other critical areas? Because we don't need to educate people on psychology when what we're giving them feedback and criticism about is not about psychology. You're an educator. If you're giving criticism, you're in the role of a teacher. You are in the role of an educator. So if it's in your ballpark, if you are talking about a subject you're an expert in, educate the person you are giving criticism and feedback to. You know, say, I know what this problem is. There's a book about it I read. Great. And again, that's something you can use self-disclosure, going back to self-disclosure. This can be used in psychoeducation. You can say, I've had that problem, but this is a resource I used. So again, self-disclosure as a tool. So yeah, always be looking to educate and provide sources to people when giving criticism, because even if what you say doesn't necessarily sink in, if they take away, oh, we mentioned a book, I might go read that. You might have done something at least. Interpretation, this is a big one, and it's a difficult one, and that's the reason it's just above confrontation. This is probably the second most difficult one, because you are taking hold of someone else's narrative and you are taking the reins. So you are offering them your interpretation, and it's an interpretation you are using to challenge their view. So you are taking their interpretation, you're looking at the situation, looking at concrete objects. So concrete objects means the events as they actually happened, in psychobabble terms. So if something's concrete, it means it's physical. It means it's something we can interact with. So if it's a behavior, that's happened. So you are reinterpreting and offering your interpretation of concrete events. So in this regard, if you're using this as a critical skill or a mentoring skill, this would be to look at the person's work and then offer, this is what I got from it, is that what your intended message was? Is this what you had intended to achieve? What were you trying to do with this? This is what I saw, this is how I interpreted your goals. That can be, you know, again, a useful skill, but very dangerous, because you, again, if you're not, if you're not careful, you can sound as though you're talking complete nonsense if you've not really sat back and thought about it. So don't rush to offer your own interpretation, because that's what a lot of people do. They rush to give their own interpretation, and it's completely wrong. 7, confrontation. The most dangerous of challenging skills. Going back to rapport and being a trusted resource. If you confront someone too soon in your in your helping relationship, your trusting relationship, your mentoring relationship, if you confront something they deeply believe or feel, and you are saying, no, that's not quite right, you are challenging a very important part of their self-identity. And doing that at the wrong time, under the wrong circumstances, and not being trusted, you're going to get the same silent Billy Connolly was taught from it. If they're polite, you'll get it out loud if you're not. So confrontation Yeah, it's basically confrontation is you are directly saying no, that's not right. And generally speaking, it will be about ethics and morals. We would use confrontation to confront maladaptive behaviours and beliefs, such as racism. Especially if it was leading to violent behaviours. Certain religious practices, if it was leading to self-harm and danger to others. So confrontation is not necessarily something you would use as a critic or in a mentoring relationship, but you might be called to do it if something did happen. Especially if something was tone deaf or completely out of step, such as poorly thought out satire, or a joke that just does not fly anymore in the 21st century. Confrontation is not really about confronting a person for being problematic. It's about protecting them from themselves more often than not. It's about saying, no, if you carry on with this way of thinking, of this way, you're going to run into trouble. You're going to. And generally speaking, it's about attacking irrationality or unfounded ideas. And this brings us to 8, repairing relationships. You do any of the stuff I've just talked about, you have a potential to damage the relationship, because you're inviting the person to do something they might not be interested in doing. You might be actively arguing with that person. You might be challenging things that person feels about themselves. You could be inadvertently making the people feel foolish or stupid because they start realizing, okay, I really didn't think this out. Repairing relationships is a challenging thing. It's realizing when you've done the damage. It's realizing when you need to say, hold on a moment, things aren't as they should be. We need to talk this out. That's all it is. It's just acknowledging there's a problem and seeking to repair it. And again, that can be a challenging skill because, again, you are challenging a person saying, look, I do not feel things are as they should be. So you are challenging the situation. So accepting and rejecting criticism. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to start rushing a bit, guys, to get to a Q&A, but we are almost done. So this is accepting and rejecting criticism. First one is vetting. Is the individual a valid source of critical information? Do you know the person? Do they know you? Do they understand you? Do they understand what you've been trying to do? Are they an expert in a position who should be remarking on what you're doing? If you've entered a music competition, yes, you will probably want to hear something off the judge. You probably don't want to hear critical feedback off a guy who was just sat at the back listening, unless he suddenly presented that he was an award-winning composer. Then you might think differently. But definitely, yes, vet the person who's giving you criticism, because this is a step which can save you a lot of pain and trouble. Because do this to yourself as well. Ask yourself, why am I coming here to offer criticism? Why am I thinking about offering criticism? Because sometimes you might feel as though you have to because of the position you're in. I mean, a lot of us in this chat right now are mentors to people as Jedi, and we might feel as, okay, we need to offer feedback here. Sometimes, guys, we're not the right person. And don't feel obligated to pretend you're the right person just because you're a mentor. That's dangerous and it's reckless. Think back to what I talked about with discipline and competency. If you're not the right person, you might be their mentor, you might be the person they usually come to for help, but you might not be the right person. So vet yourself and vet the people you take criticism from as well. That's not to say that you should ignore forms of criticism, no. It's taking a critical look at where the criticism is coming from. You can still look at criticism which comes from a person you don't like. And to be frank, their criticism could still have validity. So sometimes it's always worth looking at criticism. But a lot of the time, if you need to save time, this can be very important, and it's more important to vet yourself than necessarily vet other people. Manage the first reaction. Going back to earlier, people's first reaction to criticism is to feel negative. It's to feel sad, it's to feel upset. Manage that first reaction. So when it's yourself, take a moment to breathe. Take a moment to breathe. And let that immediate first gut reaction pass, and just go on and start framing criticism as an opportunity to learn. This person is offering you knowledge. It could be helpful. There could be positives that come from this criticism. So the big thing is managing that first emotional reaction. And that goes for other people as well. Give people time when you start. And it's going back to what I was talking about. Let people have silence to take things in. Don't keep going when a person is obviously not engaging you, but they're engaging their internal world, where they just feel as though, oh, this person's just criticised me. Manage that first reaction, because the first reaction more often than not will be negative. They will just close in on themselves. So you need to work on opening them up by giving them time, by framing the criticism as an opportunity to learn. None of us are perfect. Is step 4, sorry. So if we take a stage, for example, I can know what I'm doing on stage. I can think it's going perfectly well. Someone who stood off the stage will have a different perspective of what I'm doing. And it's very important I know what that perspective is, because guess what? If I'm on an act doing stage work, I need to know what the people in the audience are seeing and receiving. So people who have watched you or looked at your work are coming to you from a different angle. They have seen your work from a different angle. They have a different set of knowledge and perspective about what you've just done. And you can use that as a valuable resource. Because you only have your limited view of what you've done. This is, again, going back to the stage example, this is why directors exist. This is why choreographers and so on and so forth. It's very difficult if you're not part of a team. Just getting on stage and doing willy-nilly, very difficult to do. Pause and consider. Yeah, take time to think. Very simple, going back to silence. Take time to think. When you're offered criticism, sit back, take time to think. Just pause and consider. Just think things through. 6. Frame the feedback in functional terms. Reject reasons. So, a lot of criticism, especially going back to the vetting process, is when you get it from random angry people on the internet, generally they'll frame their criticism in some rude remarks against your person. That stuff's useless. But they might hide something in their nonsense which is actually useful. A good example of this I had is when I wrote a article for a psychology journal just for university, and someone wrote this quite rude email to me, but halfway through I discovered this really interesting question, which was, A, had absolutely nothing to do with B. Why on earth did you discuss that? And it made me look back and say, actually, he's actually right there. I didn't justify how B had anything to do with A. In how I've written it, I've just presumed people would know this. So yeah, there's a lot of nonsense in there, and it was quite upsetting. But there's something useful in there. So sometimes you can get useful stuff out of something which is 90% useless. So again, going back to sometimes your best critics are your worst enemies. Always plan time for processing and reflection. Do not crit and run. A big thing I see, especially when people are in a rush, is people give criticism on the run. They meet up for a short meeting. They offer this feedback. They say, this is what's gone wrong. You need to sort it. Goodbye. And you've just left this person reeling because you've come along, and to them you've just come along, given them a bollocking and run off. You wouldn't appreciate it for yourself, so don't do it to other people. And if you do know you are going into a situation where you are likely to be given strong feedback, plan time for yourself to take that feedback in and work on it. Again, a big mistake I see with a lot of people operating projects and so forth is they go from one meeting to the next, and by the end of the day they're just distraught because what their mind is on just all the criticism they've received through the day, and they've had no time to process any of it in a meaningful way. So give yourself time to process criticism, especially when you're expecting it. Finally, it's a two-way street. Going back to the conversation idea, asking questions, coming to an understanding of what someone's talking about or what they've done. You become responsible. You enter a relationship with someone when you offer them criticism, when you offer them feedback. Because again, as I said, they can ask you for more. They might not reject you. They could reject you. But it's a two-way street. And you might learn something from giving criticism and finding your criticism challenged. Criticism is a conversation. It's not one-sided. Because something is going to come from your criticism. Even if it feels one-sided, even if you get these actors and stuff that don't read critics, that is a statement about critics. They don't read critics, they are rejecting the critic's advice. So they are going to, that is still a statement on criticism. Okay, so use of criticism as pathway to growth. In the last 5 minutes, I finally give you the magic ingredients, everyone, that everyone came to this lecture for. The magic, the golden pot at the end of the rainbow. We finally have it. We have come to see the wizard. Yeah. None of us improve when ignorant of what we are doing wrong. None of us improve when ignorant of what we are doing right. None of us can change without an imperative to change. That's criticism of the pathway to growth. That's all it is. You're just using it to understand these things. Criticism of the self, you talk to yourself and say to yourself, I don't like this about myself. I feel I'm doing this wrong. Well, okay. You now have an imperative to change. If someone else offers you criticism about your performance and what you're doing, well, now you know what you're doing right to still keep on doing that, but you also know what's wrong, and you then have an imperative to change. That's all criticism is. There's nothing magical about criticism. It's how you use it. And the reality is people reject it because it feels awful. Our natural ego protection is to feel awful about it and avoid it. But a bad day is not a bad life. One negative experience does not make your life a negative experience. Just because people naturally experience criticism as upsetting doesn't necessarily mean criticism is a bad thing. We've used it as human beings for millennia to become better people, to produce better people. And criticism comes in so many different forms that we don't necessarily think about it. As I said, self-reflection. We criticize ourselves all the time. And sometimes that helps us improve, other times it doesn't. When we stand in the mirror and go, oh, you fat git. I've done it. I think a lot of us have done it. Stood in front of a mirror and not been happy about our body. And that's self-criticism. And it makes us think about what are we doing wrong. Gives us an imperative to change. Advice is criticism. Any good advice is a form of criticism because you're basically saying to that person, you need to follow this advice because if you don't, you're doing it wrong. All good advice is a criticism of what not having good advice leads you down the road to. Any knowledge which challenges you is a form of criticism. Anything that challenges your beliefs, your perspectives, your ideas about the world, that challenge you and that's a criticism of who you are. Whether you've invited it into the world by watching a video, by reading a book, you are opening yourself up to criticism of your worldview. And I shall just leave you with this quote, because time is running out. Criticism, if embraced for what it is, becomes a mirror by which to recognise what we can change, but also what is great about ourselves. That is good constructive criticism. It tells us what we are doing right. It tells us how we are being good people already, how we are succeeding already. Because if you keep on succeeding, keep on doing, you're going to have a lot easier time sorting out what's wrong. Correction coaching is the lowest form of coaching. If you're always constantly correcting people, they're always going to be distracted by what they're doing wrong, and they'll never get anywhere. And finally, the disappearance of the sense of responsibility is the most far-reaching consequence of submission to authority. Stanley Milgram. Criticism is only as effective or useful or as important as the responsibility you take for yourself on receiving it. This also has a lot more wide-ranging consequences than that, but I like that quote. It's one of my favourites. Okay.